Matthew Tambai with Fast Math here. Do you know how big a million, a billion, and a trillion actually are? In business, you hear about millions, billions, and trillions of dollars, and millions and billions of people. But most people can't visualize these numbers and don't really understand how big these numbers actually are. In this video, I'm going to help you understand more intuitively just how big these numerical values are in terms of money and in terms of people. This is really important to understand if you work in business or want to work in business. This video builds on my prior videos that explain how to multiply large numbers and do other calculations without counting zeros, or what I call no zero multiplication and no zero calculations. If you haven't watched these videos, definitely watch them before watching the rest of this video. Links are in the description. I'm going to help you understand and visualize how big the units of magnitude of thousand, million, billion, and trillion are in terms of people and in terms of money or dollars. This is relevant because large businesses have millions and billions of dollars in revenue per year and have millions or billions of customers. As a refresher, here are the definitions of these units of magnitude. Thousand is 10 to the third, million is 10 to the sixth, billion is 10 to the ninth, and trillion is 10 to the 12th. The term unit of magnitude is a word that refers to a numerical value, and in this video, the term unit of magnitude refers to one of these numerical values, 1,000, million, billion, or trillion. There are larger units of magnitude, which I'll discuss in later fast math videos. And I'll use the word unit as shorthand for unit of magnitude in this video. There are other types of units, such as units of distance, like miles or kilometers, and units of mass, etc. But we're not discussing these types of units in this video. So in this video, the word unit refers to one of these units of magnitude of 1,000, million, billion, or trillion. And these are the abbreviations we'll use for each of these units of magnitude. K is the abbreviation for 1,000, and the abbreviations for the other units are simply the first letter of the unit name. M is for million, B is for billion, and T is for trillion. Now, since we use the letter T for trillion, we need to use another letter for the abbreviation for 1,000. And we use K for 1,000, which comes from the word kilo, which means 1,000. And these are the abbreviations that Fast Math uses, and these abbreviations are frequently used in business as well. And the term unit value refers to the numerical value associated with each unit of magnitude and with each abbreviation. To review the main idea from my prior videos on no zero calculations, the value of each unit is 1,000 times the value of the next smaller unit. So 1,000 is what I call the unit ratio. And defining K as 1,000, we can define the unit values relative to 1,000 or relative to K. And we can do this using long form format or unit abbreviations. So the abbreviation K is just another way to represent the value of 1,000. And the other abbreviations take on the numerical value of the unit of magnitude. Starting at the value of 1,000 or K, 1,000 has the value of 1,000 times 1. And using abbreviations, we can write this 1,000 using the abbreviation K. So this is equal to K times 1, which is equal to K to the first, or 1,000 to the first. I'm going to go through this quickly because I cover this in detail in my prior videos on no zero calculations. Million is 1,000 times 1,000, or 1,000 K. That is, a million is 1,000 of the next smaller unit, which is 1,000, which is represented by the abbreviation K. And using all abbreviations, writing this 1,000 with the abbreviation K, million is then K times K, or K squared, which is 1,000 squared. And again, this just writes 1,000 as K. So it's this entry, but with this 1,000 written as K. Billion is 1,000 millions, or 1,000 times M. Using abbreviations, billion is K times M, which is K to the third, or 1,000 to the third. Note that when I read a unit abbreviation out loud, I normally say the full unit name. So when I read this out loud, I would normally say 1,000 millions, not 1,000 M. But for this portion, as you're learning the concept, I may sometimes say the letter for the abbreviation, such as M, to indicate what is written, and to indicate that it's using an abbreviation. Trillion is 1,000 billions, or 1,000 times B. Using abbreviations, trillion is K times B, which is K to the fourth, or 1,000 to the fourth. The key point is that 1,000 or K times any unit gives you the next larger unit. And this is the key principle of no zero multiplication. In this table, we always use abbreviations for the next smaller unit. And in this column, we use the abbreviation K for the 1,000 multiplier. Here's the same data with each element in a separate cell in the table, with one new column showing the powers of 1,000 with 1,000 in long form format. And these columns all show the same information and represent the unit value in slightly different ways. The key point is that these units of magnitude are simply powers of 1,000 and are 1,000 times the next smaller unit value. This column has 1,000 in long form, so million is 1,000 times k, and this column has the abbreviation k for 1,000. This column shows the unit value as a power of 1,000 using the abbreviation k for 1,000, so the unit value is a power of k, and this column shows the unit value as a power of 1,000 with 1,000 in long form format. So the exponents start at 1 and go up by 1 with each row. Now, how many people is a million people? Can you visualize a million people? How much can you buy with $1 million? Or $1 billion? Or even $1 trillion? To understand how many people a million people are, we're going to use an example that people can understand. Let's imagine there is a highly contagious disease and you wanted to vaccinate 1 million people. If it takes a doctor 1 hour to vaccinate each patient, how long would it take one doctor to vaccinate 1 million people? The purpose of this calculation is to understand how big a million is. To answer this, you need to make some estimates about the doctor's working hours. I'll estimate that the doctor works 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 50 weeks per year. This means they have weekends and 2 weeks off per year. These are common assumptions for working hours in business math. Go ahead and use these assumptions to calculate how long it would take one doctor to vaccinate 1 million people. Solution in 3, 2, 1. This means that the doctor works 40 hours per week, as 8 hours per day times 5 days a week is 40 hours per week, and the doctor works 2,000 hours per year, as 40 hours per week times 50 weeks per year equals 2,000 hours per year. So the doctor can vaccinate 2,000 patients per year, as each patient takes 1 hour. And to calculate the number of years required, we need to divide 1 million patients by 2,000 patients per year, which is 1,000 thousands divided by 2,000. We can represent 2,000 as 2k, where k is the abbreviation for 1,000, and a million is 1,000 thousands, so we can represent a million as 1,000 times k. I discussed this in my previous videos on no-zero calculations. Links are in the description. So this is 1 million divided by 2,000. Now the k's cancel, so we have 1,000 divided by 2, which is 500. So it would take 500 years for one doctor to vaccinate 1 million people if it takes 1 hour per patient. This is obviously longer than the doctor's lifetime, as people rarely live past 100 years. So it would take longer than a lifetime to vaccinate 1 million people. And you can do similar calculations if the doctor is working 10 hours per day, which yields 400 years to vaccinate 1 million people, or even 6 days per week. The main takeaway is that 1 million people is a lot of people. Now consider that the population of the United States is over 300 million people and is closer to 340 million people. We use the abbreviation M for million. Most major cities in the US, like Boston or Seattle, have a population in their metropolitan region of about 5 million people, with some cities having more. The Los Angeles metropolitan region has over 12 million people, and the New York metropolitan region has over 18 million people. So vaccinating a city of 5 million people would take a single doctor 2,500 years with our initial assumptions. Therefore, in terms of business analysis, if you were in charge of vaccinating people, you would want to reduce the time needed to vaccinate each person. So that's why health officials set up mass vaccination sites in stadiums and similar sites, because that reduced the time spent by healthcare professionals with each patient. So this helps put the number million in perspective. Now, 1 billion people is even more people. 1 billion is 1,000 millions, and 1 billion people is really hard to visualize. So we'll work to understand how big 1 billion is. Again, we use the abbreviation B for billion, and we'll start by visualizing 1,000 people. Try to visualize 1,000 people. How much space do they take up? We'll start by visualizing 10 people. Imagine 2 groups of 5 people. That's 10. 100 is easy to visualize as 10 groups of 10 people. That is, 100 is 10 times 10. So 100 people would fit in 10 rows of seats, where each row had 10 people sitting in it. So this square is 10 by 10, which is 100. And this might fit into a section of a theater. Now imagine 1,000 people. 1,000 is 10 groups of 100. So 1,000 people could fit in 10 sections of a theater where each section had 100 people consisting of 10 rows where each row has 10 people in it. Each small red square represents one seat or person. Each larger square is 10 by 10, which is 100. We have 10 larger squares, which are each 100. So in all, this is 1,000 small red squares. You can count them if you like. In the theater analogy, each small red square represents a seat for one person, and each large square is a section with 100 seats in it. So this would be 10 sections of 100 seats each, so this would be 1,000 seats. Using math, we don't have to count them all one by one. Now, if you pack 1,000 people close together, how much space would they take up? If you do the math, 1,000 people can fit into a square with about 31 people on each side, as the square root of 1,000 is 31.6. So if people are about 1 yard or 1 meter apart, center to center, 1,000 people would fit into a square that is about 31 yards or meters on each side. A yard is about a meter. Being more precise, a meter is about 1.1 yards. And a person's step is a little less than a yard or a meter, so 1,000 people would likely fit into a square that is about 40 steps by 40 steps, depending on the length of the step. Go outside and measure a square that is about 31 yards or meters on each side, or about 40 steps on each side. It's not that big, so you wouldn't actually need that much space for 1,000 people if they are packed close together. Now, 1,000,000 people is 1,000 thousands, which becomes harder to visualize. Now, 1,000,000 people is 1,000 groups of 1,000 people, which becomes harder to visualize. So we have to use mathematics and quantitative analysis to understand how big 1,000,000 is. As we discussed, if you need to spend 1 hour per person with 1,000,000 people, it takes a lot of time, longer than a lifetime. As mentioned, many large American cities have about 5 million people in the metropolitan area. The entire United States has a population of about 340 million. Lots of other countries have populations in the hundreds of millions or tens of millions of people. Now remember, a billion is 1,000 millions. Only 2 countries, China and India, have more than 1 billion people, and they both have about 1.4 billion people, or 1,400 million people. B is the abbreviation for billion, and when I read the abbreviations out loud, I generally say the full unit name, so I would read this as 1.4 billion. My free business calculation course has lots of data on the populations of other countries as well, which you need to know for interviews at management consulting firms. Links are below. The population of the entire world is about 8 billion, or 8,000 million people. So to count people, we don't need units of magnitude larger than billion. Now we're going to examine the buying power of thousands, millions, billions, and trillions of dollars. We're going to look at the buying power of each of these numerical values in US dollars, as I'm from the United States. But euros, British pounds, and Canadian and Australian dollars all have similar buying power. So this analysis applies to these currencies as well. How much is $1 million? It sounds like a lot of money, but we're going to examine how big it really is now. Let's look at $1,000. In some low or medium cost cities, $1,000 might cover monthly rent for a small apartment or a room in a shared house outside the city center. $1,000 might cover rent on a full apartment or house in a lower cost city. Depends on where you're looking, but you'll often find that you can find some accommodation for $1,000 a month or less. But this won't get you a full apartment in Manhattan or downtown Boston. In general, in some more expensive cities, rent is $2,000 to $5,000 or more per month for an apartment, depending on the apartment and the city. Apartments in the most expensive locations like Manhattan or central London are even more expensive. So $10,000 could cover monthly living expenses for one person, including rent, utilities, and entertainment. Again, it depends on where you live, but you'll find that somebody can certainly live on $10,000 a month. So over the course of the year, spending $10,000 per month is $120,000 per year. We'll round that to $100,000 per year. So $100,000 could cover the living expenses for one person for a year. Again, it depends on the lifestyle and expenditures, but it's certainly possible to live on $100,000 per year. If you're spending $100,000 per year, how long would $1 million last? Again, a million is 1,000 thousands, or 1,000 K. So dividing a million by 100,000 per year is 10. That is, 1,000 K divided by 100 K is 10. So $1 million would last 10 years if you spent $100,000 per year, which is roughly $8,300 per month. So $1 million probably isn't enough to retire on. Now, if you had $10 million, that would last 100 years if you were spending $100,000 per year. That's, of course, if your money isn't growing or you weren't investing it. So $10 million provides a nice nest egg for a single person. But if you have a family, your expenditures are more. Buying a house might cost $2 million, $3 million, or $4 million in some cities, or even more, depending on the house and location. So that's $1 million and $10 million. Now, $100 million is where you have enough money to not really have to worry about money too much, and to be truly financially independent and have financial freedom for a family of multiple people. How much is $1 billion? How long would $1 billion last if you spent $100,000 per year? If you spent $100,000 per year, $1 billion would last 10,000 years. So $1 billion is an enormous amount of money for a single person or family. Again, $100,000 per year is about $8,300 per month. So that puts the buying power of thousands, millions, and billions of dollars into context for a person or family. Now we'll discuss buying power of millions of dollars for a company. We'll look at how many employees a company can hire for $1 million a year. Some business professional roles, like accountants or analysts, might cost a company $100,000 per year. And you can then hire 10 such people for $1 million a year. Again, 1 million divided by 100,000 is 10. You may have some less expensive roles that cost $50,000 per year, like call center reps, and you could then hire 20 call center reps for $1 million a year, or 20 people that cost $50,000 a year if you had $1 million. So this is all the buying power of $1 million. Software engineers might cost $250,000 per year or more, and you could hire 4 software engineers at $250,000 per year with $1 million per year. So you'd need $1 million per year to keep these people employed, assuming these costs are fully loaded with salary and benefits and other costs. Of course, costs may be different, and some engineers may have total costs higher than $250,000, but this gives you an idea of the number of employees a company can hire. In general, $1 million per year could pay for 4 skilled software engineers and up to 20 people at $50,000 per year. Now we'll examine billions of dollars in the context of companies. $1 billion is 1,000 millions. So you get billions of dollars in annual revenue if you have millions of customers who spend thousands of dollars per year. For example, if Apple sells 10 million iPhones a year for $1,000 each, that's $10 billion in annual revenue. The basic math is that we can multiply the numerical portions and the units of magnitude separately. 10 times 1 is 10, and million times 1,000 is billion. That is, 1,000 millions makes 1 billion, so the result is $10 billion. In fact, since we are multiplying by 1,000, we can just promote the unit of magnitude from million to billion and keep the numerical portion of 10 the same, meaning we don't need to explicitly write this line. If a company sells 30 million computers for $2,000 each, that is $60 billion in revenue. 30 times 2 is 60, and again, million times 1,000 is billion, so the result is $60 billion. This is very important to understand before we move on. I discussed this method in detail in my videos on no-zero multiplication and no-zero calculations, so definitely watch these videos if you haven't already. Links are in the description. There are many companies with billions of dollars in annual revenue. Walmart has over $570 billion in annual revenue, and Walmart has the largest revenue of any company in the United States. Amazon has over $500 billion in annual revenue. Apple has over $390 billion in annual revenue. These companies do over $1 billion in revenue per day. Google has over $280 billion in revenue, Microsoft over $200 billion in revenue, and Meta over $110 billion in revenue. And again, a billion is 1,000 millions. So B equals K times M, or 1,000 millions is a billion. So this puts billions of dollars in revenue in context. You can think of $1 billion in revenue as millions of customers, each spending thousands of dollars per year. Billions in revenue is also tens of millions of customers, each spending hundreds of dollars per year. And these are some of the largest companies in the world, and they have hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue. There are lots of other companies with over $1 billion in annual revenue. But you need to have large scale to get to billions of dollars in revenue. You either need millions of customers spending thousands of dollars per year, or tens of millions of customers spending hundreds of dollars per year. And 1 million people is a lot of people, as we discussed earlier. So getting to $1 billion in annual revenue is a big milestone. So this puts billions of dollars in context for a company. Now we'll talk about conceptualizing $1 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billions, so with abbreviations, T equals K times B, or 1,000 times B. There are no companies with trillions of dollars in revenue yet, but there are companies with valuations in the trillions of dollars, such as Apple, Microsoft, and Google. To get to trillions of dollars, you have to consider the output or production of entire countries, which is called the gross domestic product, or GDP, of a country, which measures the value of all goods and services produced in a country in a year. It is a measure of the overall size of the economy. So trillions of dollars would be billions of people times thousands of dollars in GDP per person or per capita. What do you think the GDP of the United States is? What are the 5 countries with the largest GDPs in the world? We'll analyze it like this. The United States has a population of about 340 million people, and the GDP per capita, or production per person per year, is about $75,000 per person per year. The exact number depends on who measures it and how they measure it, so you'll see different values. We'll round these values to 300 million people and GDP per capita of $80,000. Multiplying the population by the GDP per capita gives us the total GDP. That is, GDP per capita is the production per person per year. Multiplying production per person per year by the number of people gives total production per year, or total GDP. If you multiply 300 million by $80,000, you get $24,000 billion, which is $24 trillion. Doing the math, 300 times 80 is 24,000. 3 times 8 is 24. There are 3 zeros, so we have 24 with 3 zeros, which is 24,000. Multiplying the units of magnitude, million times thousand is billion. So 300 million times 80,000 is $24,000 billion, which is $24 trillion. Using more accurate values of 340 million people and $75,000 in GDP per capita, you get a total GDP of $25.5 trillion. And official estimates are around $25.5 trillion. And we can round this to $25 trillion. This is close to our original estimate of $24 trillion, where we use rounded values. Using the rounded values of 300 million people and GDP per capita of $80,000 gives us a pretty good estimate of the total GDP very quickly. So this puts trillions of dollars into context. The output of the entire United States, which has over 340 million people, over a full year is about $25 trillion. And the US has the largest economy in the world. Here is a table of the 10 countries with the largest economies in the world. It shows population, GDP per capita, and total GDP, and these are rounded values. So you see a range in GDP per capita as well as population. GDP per capita tells us the relative wealth of the country. The US has the largest economy of about $25 trillion, and total world GDP is about $100 trillion. Let's look at the United Kingdom. The population is about 60 million people. We're going to round these values further to make these calculations faster. And GDP per capita, we'll round that to $50,000. And GDP per capita, we'll round that to $50,000. 60 million times $50,000 is $3,000 billion, which is $3 trillion. So total GDP of the United Kingdom is about $3 trillion. Germany has a population of about 80 million people and GDP per capita of $50,000. And 80 million times $50,000 is $4,000 billion, which is $4 trillion. So you get to trillions of dollars in GDP if you have tens of millions of people with tens of thousands of dollars of GDP per capita. Also note that you need multiples of tens of millions of people and multiples of tens of thousands of dollars in GDP per capita to get to $1 trillion of GDP, as 10 million people times $10,000 in GDP per capita is only $100 billion in total GDP. So basically, as you can see with Germany and the United Kingdom, we have 8 times 10 million people and more than 6 times 10 million people respectively. And the GDPs are in multiples of tens of thousands of dollars. It's not just $10,000. That's the way you get to $1 trillion. High-income countries have GDPs in multiples of tens of thousands of dollars per year. I'll define high income as GDP per capita of over $40,000 per year. So take $50,000 as a round starting value. You get to $1 trillion in GDP if you have 20 million people with $50,000 of GDP per capita. If you have a country with GDP per capita of $40,000, they need 25 million people to have a GDP of $1 trillion. You also get to trillions of dollars in GDP if you have billions of people with thousands of dollars in GDP per capita. There are only 2 countries with populations of over 1 billion people, and China and India both have populations of about 1.4 billion people. China has a GDP of just over $12,000. This gives a total GDP of $18 trillion, second only to the United States. India has a GDP per capita of about $2.3 thousand. Multiplying by the population of 1.4 billion, you get a total GDP of about $3.2 trillion. If we round the values for India and use a population of 1.5 billion and GDP per capita of $2,000, India's GDP would be $3,000. 1.5 billion times 2,000 is $3 trillion. Again, 1.5 times 2 is 3, and billion times 1,000 is trillion. And rounding these values helps us estimate the value quickly and determine the order of magnitude of the answer with only a little bit of calculation. So India's GDP is close to $3 trillion, and that's easy to see if we just round these values. 1.5 billion times 2,000, 1.5 times 2 is 3, billion times 1,000 is trillion. Again, the GDP of the entire world is about $100 trillion. So in business math, we don't generally need to use units of magnitude greater than trillions when dealing with money, as the total world GDP is about $100 trillion, and no company has revenues in the trillions of dollars. So that's trillions of dollars, which is thousands of billions, or tens of thousands times tens of millions. So $1 trillion is really a lot of money because it measures the production of entire industrial countries in a whole year. So that's millions, billions, and trillions. Please like the video if you did, and subscribe or follow to be notified about new Fast Math videos. Other Fast Math videos cover these topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. And remember, keep calculating.